It's my pleasure to be attending the Manitoba Child Care Association's 40th annual conference in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and even further my pleasure to be speaking with Pat Wege, Executive Director of the Manitoba Child Care Association, in her how many years of being at the MCCA, Pat?
This is my 20th as the Executive Director, and I was on the Board of Directors for 10 years before that.
So that's the perfect springboard to start talking about how you got to this position, when you started working with children in early childhood. Talk to us a little bit about your career and how you've got to where you are today.
Well, thanks, Don. So, someone once said that sometimes God has bigger plans for you than you have for yourself. And when I think back over the last 40 years now that I've been working in childcare, since 1976, actually, it is like that for me. So I never planned on working in childcare. I was going to be a kindergarten teacher. And so I guess I was 76, I completed what was then at the University of Manitoba. They had an early childhood education program. And I left that program with my shiny new teaching certificate in hand and set out looking for a job in the public school system, which really wasn't available unless I was willing to work outside of Winnipeg, and as a newlywed at that time, and my husband was still in school himself. So what happened was I had a cousin who was working at Champlain School, teaching grade 1, and the principal of that school, whose name was David Buckingham, was working with a group of parents to set up a daycare center in a church down the street. So she, my cousin, knew that I was job hunting for something related to children and suggested I meet with him because I might be interested in working with this group to set up a daycare center. And I'm going to admit, I didn't know much about a daycare center at the time. And it took me a few years to realize that once I had gotten out into the field and met a few other people, not many others knew much about what running a daycare center was about. Anyway, so that's how it happened, that I decided that I would volunteer to help this group set up this daycare center. And then I was eventually hired to be the director. That was in 1976. And I was with that daycare center for probably 20 years after that. And so, did the path of starting it up and getting it launched and the grants and the funding and just making it all happen. And so that's how I got involved in childcare.
So what about the segue then to be involved with the association, and by extension, did you know at that time how political this would become for you?
No, to any of the questions. Becoming involved with MCCA was actually quite an accident. And I recall, and I can't tell you when it was, but somebody inviting me to come to a meeting of a public policy committee that I agreed to go to. And I sat in on one meeting and never went back. I've never told anybody this. So I never went back. I thought, this is not for me. These people are all nuts. It's not what I can see myself doing. I'm out of here. And so I didn't go back. At some point later, and I can't even tell you how much later, but I was friends with Lorraine Maskew, who at that time was the executive director at Carolot Day Nursery. She was on the MCCA board. And so Lorraine and I would often have these long conversations about childcare in Manitoba and where it was going or where it shouldn't be, like all the woes that directors talk about when they get together. And she said, look, you should come on MCCA board because that is the place to share your ideas and opinions about things. So I agreed and was welcomed to that board in between AGM. So I never went through that whole election thing. They had a seat on the board and I was invited to attend, and it stuck. And 10 years later, I was still there. So I think I was on the board for probably 2, maybe 3 years as just a board member. And then I was quickly asked to be on their executive committee, which they had at the time. And then probably within about 4 years, I found myself elected as chair of the board. And that's how that happened.
I don't think we've ever talked about some of those things, Pat. That's great. That's great. So 20 years as executive director now. How many as chair then?
Well, at that time, I chair of the board. Now it's 2 years. At that time, it was three. And so I did my 3 years as chairperson of the board. And then I was just finishing up as past chairperson of the board, which was 1 year, and thought, well, I'm close to being done, I guess. And then Dorothy Dudick, who was the executive director at the time, was invited by, at that time, the Children and Youth Secretariat to come and work for them for a year on school-age childcare. And so the board asked if I would be interested in being acting executive director for the year. And I thought about it. I thought I probably knew about as much of that position as I knew when I was starting off as the director at McRae, but I had a fairly long history with the organization at the time, so I thought I'll give it a whirl. It's only a year. And she never came back, and I never left.
Yeah. Wow. Here we are, so 20 years later, and interesting then that the Canadian Child Care Federation is celebrating its 30th year here. So let's go back to, if you recall it, what was happening 30 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago. What was the environment like in terms of political relationships, in terms of policy, compared with today? And maybe with that, some of the biggest changes you've seen, biggest challenges, and biggest successes. So lots of different pieces in there.
Yeah, you're going to have to break those questions up. So, federally or provincially, because I think they're both very different, and I'm far more familiar with provincial politics than federal. But, listening to Sandy Griffin this morning, the keynote, talking about how little has actually changed in 30 years, all of those core issues are still there. The lack of spaces across the country, certainly here in Manitoba, more than 16,000 names now in the online registry. That's huge. Wages for childcare center employees and family childcare providers continue to be below market. Sandy talked about how fees are high right across the country. Manitoba still has the second lowest fees outside of Quebec, but for families, it can still be a financial burden, even though our fees are deemed to be lower than most other provinces. So, there's a lot of core issues that have stuck, that have not changed over time. And yet sometimes it feels like we are light years away from where we were 30 years ago. I think a couple of big differences, and we found this out in the MCCA Probe Research Survey, is public opinion is really come a long way. That as a longtime advocate, I no longer feel like we need to spend time trying to convince the public that this is important. When we did that survey, we found out that the public definitely gets it. Large percentage are in favor of a universal child care program. They see the value to families, to the economy, to children. And so, that for me is probably the biggest shift. And I'm going to say, I think to some degree, I've seen a change in the opinions of political leaders. And so at this point, I've worked with two governments changes. So the NDP, I start off with a conservative government, then we shifted to an NDP for quite a number of years. Now we're back to a conservative government. But the support for childcare seems to be there. And that too is different. Sandy had given an anecdote about one of the provincial orgs going to talk to their minister and going on, and the minister concluding by saying, well, I don't believe you. That has never been my experience, actually. I think maybe things are different here in Manitoba, but to some degree, every single provincial party has continued to fund childcare, even at our lowest point, probably in the 80s. We didn't do any growing, but we also didn't do much shrinking. And then, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, childcare really moved forward under that government. And, we're seeing good signs now from our newly elected PC government. So political will is definitely grown, which makes the job of an advocate much easier. I've always believed that that's the number one ingredient. Most important factor in building a childcare system is going to be political will. If you don't have the support of your parties, you're not going to go anywhere. So, I've seen the workforce evolve. Of course, compensation still is a problem. Like I said, people seem to be really engaged in their work. I've long admired the loyalty of the workforce. Oftentimes when I go to grand openings of new facilities, the politicians are there taking credit for a very small part of what was actually their role, because it's the community that's built the childcare system. That's the way it started for me in 1974. I had to figure it out without much help. And that's the way it often still is in 2017, that you have a group of people come together and say, we need a daycare center, and then they get to do the work to make it happen. So whether it's staff of an existing facility or a group of community members, like-minded, who want to establish a childcare program, they figure it out. It can take years, but they definitely, and that's how our system has evolved, is with the blood, sweat, and tears, oftentimes, of volunteers or poorly paid early childhood educators. So, I would like to see a day when the provincial government takes a larger role in the establishment of new facilities, in the same way they do for example, autopack outlets that just seem to pop up, or, liquor stores. The new community equals a liquor store pretty darn quick, but there is no childcare program. So I think I've forgotten half of what you asked me now, but so, we are moving on, and I've never felt discouraged. We've had a few low points, certainly with the termination of the federal provincial funding agreements in 2006 that we worked so hard for. We as a community worked so hard for that. We worked hard here in Manitoba, and I know our colleagues across the country also worked on that. We thought we had turned a corner. I was so proud that day when our agreement was signed. We had the Prime Minister, we had the Premier at the time, provincial politicians signed on the dotted line our bilateral agreement, came with a lot of money. We had such big plans, and then, the ink was barely dry when we went into a federal election and those agreements were terminated. That was heartbreaking. But, we moved on. And I think Canadian childcare has continued to move forward. So, maybe some felt that was the end of it for them, but provinces continued to develop their systems as best they could without the federal funds. And, I think it was pretty good testimony to the strength and endurance and commitment of Canadian childcare that the system continued to grow. So here we are now. It's 2017. We're on the cusp now of the re-signing of new multilateral agreements, new bilaterals, more federal money coming to provinces, not as much, but, we'll take what they're going to offer. And as advocates, we'll work on our own constituencies to make sure it's spent in the best way that we need.
So you mentioned the word advocacy a few times in Advocates. Lessons after these years that you can impart on people?
Yeah, well, I've been part of MCCA through some pretty bold advocacy campaigns, launched with noise and vigor. I'm recalling, our infamous now Peanut Day, where we wanted to make the point that, childcare workers earn peanuts. And so the campaign that MCCA launched was to encourage childcare centers and individuals to send peanuts to the minister at the time and, make the point about peanuts. And it got great media attention. But, it didn't really help move the issue forward because the government got mad. And when I had said before about political will being key, well, I think that day we lost any political will because, as it turns out, if you embarrass a politician or a party, they're not going to talk to you anymore. But at the time, we thought we were doing something marvelous. We got in the news and our members were engaged, happy to participate. I think they looked to the organization for leadership, and this was something that they could all do. But I will also say that I think that backfired, even though at the time I too was sending peanuts. But we also did a day of demonstration, to try and make a point where childcare programs throughout the province were encouraged to close for the day, and we marched on the ledge. And I think we did get a little bit more money out of that one, but the following year it was taken away, so it didn't have any long-lasting impact. So the organization did lead a number of very public, very strong advocacy events to try and get government's attention for this cause. But again, I'm going to emphasize there was no long-lasting change that came of it. And then, I'm trying to remember the year, it was probably mid-90s. We actually hired a consultant to work with us on a government relations plan. And we learned a few things from that consultant about the importance of relationships, even with our political leaders. And so we, as early childhood educators, talk a lot about relationships with children. We talk about relationships with families. But we don't often talk about relationships with political leaders. And for me, the takeaway from that is that political leaders are people too. They take on the job because they hope to make a difference. They don't like to be embarrassed in public. They do their best based on what they know and what the position of their party is. And so if you want to make some headway as an advocate, you better have a good relationship with those political leaders, that you need to understand their priorities and see if there are ways that you can help them move forward on what they are, even though you might not like them. And you're going to get a lot farther that way, because it will ensure you have a seat at a table, a foot in the door, and an opportunity then to have dialogue about perhaps different ways of doing things. And so the organization decided after that time that it was going to change its approach to government relations and endeavor to have a collaborative and positive working relationship with government. And so that includes elected officials. It included the bureaucrats as well. And so that made sense to us. We changed our approach. It seemed to go better. And it's a policy now, actually, of MCCA's that we've continued to use. And is in place to this day. And I like to think that we do have a close working relationship with government. We are consulted most of the time, not always. We are asked for our opinions. Different ministers have different ways that they approach our organization. Some are more interested in our opinion than others, but we're able to get meetings, we're able to ask questions, we're able to sit down at a table and have conversations. So that's what I've learned. I think that those relationships are important. And, we've also taken the approach of, when we ask for something, we try and make the ask one that government could say yes to. Because if you put something on the table that's like way out of reach, either economically or too far away from their philosophy or what they believe. You're not going to get any mileage out of that one, and then you end up both being angry because they're not doing what we want, and they say, they're crazy to ask for that at this particular time because we just can't. So, I think those are the most important lessons, certainly that have worked for us as advocates.
So MCCA is 4,000 members strong, Canada's largest provincial childcare organization. That has to be a point of pride. What else? What else is, when you look back, as real shining lights, real points of pride for you as the executive director, and along with the many boards you've worked with through the years as well?
Well, I feel like crying. I listened to Sandy this morning. She really spoke from the heart, and for me, this sector has always been. It always comes from the heart. I think it is just like that for lots of people who work in childcare, and so I've always been really proud of our workforce for their dedication. People have come and stayed. I've made a lot of good friends in the sector. I think we're pretty good at working together, so I'm proud of that too. But although many of the core issues in our field, the struggles, when I look around, I see so many improvements. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the opening of Building Blocks, the new YWCA childcare facility opened in partnership with Great West Life. It's a beautiful facility. Purpose-built, sunny, bright, plenty of space, state-of-the-art, beautifully furnished. Children should have beautiful spaces. And, for many, many, many years, too many years, it was, subterranean children and, spaces in church basements and, make-do classrooms in a, corner of a church somewhere or a community center. And so now we're seeing more and more purposely built and designed spaces for children that are beautiful. And so that makes me proud when I stand there, because I like to think that we've put so many issues on the table. One of them has certainly been the need for capital funding for community-based projects. We have a policy now that all new schools will include a childcare program as they're being built. Like, that's huge. A pension plan. MCCA put the need for a pension plan on the government's agenda probably 25 to 30 years ago, and we have that now. Sandy talked about how in many provinces the workforce doesn't have many benefits, but our workforce has access to a group benefits plan. We have access to a pension plan, professional development that we offer through MCCA. So, lots of improvements in the workforce. Even though wages aren't great, at least they are better. Our work in partnership with other organizations. I know we have a very strong relationship with People First HR services that provide HR expertise to childcare centers that are MCCA members. And we've just moved forward on so many initiatives. We have our Human Resource Management Guide that I'm really proud of. Our work with pedagogical cohorts now that's happening and moving forward. And proud of our members for supporting MCCA. We are, I am always very grateful that so many in the workforce are MCCA members, because without that, we wouldn't have the credibility, we wouldn't have the capacity, we wouldn't have the reputation that we have. So there's just a lot to be proud of. Our board has always worked hard, as you know, lots of loyal members who have stood beside the association through good times and bad, and talk about the organization with pride and see it as their organization, and really embrace that sense of belonging and importance of being part of something. And, we are respected. I see it from the political leaders. I see it from our members. I see it from the colleges, community colleges, the instructors that we. So, we've got a lot of good things happening here in Manitoba.
So Sandra Griffin in her keynote this morning talked about children at the heart of the matter, and you've mentioned that here too. So let's look forward. Let's look forward to what do you envision? What would you love to see? And I'm not going to put a timeline on it, but at some point in the future, with children at the heart of the matter and families along with them, what do we want to see, not just for Manitoba's children, but for Canada's children?
Well, I would like to see a time where early learning and childcare is recognized as the first tier of education. I think we talk about it a lot, but we're not there yet. We here in Manitoba Child Care is not part of the education system yet. I think that may be part of our future. It is a model that many other provinces have adopted, although I hear that just putting childcare into education does not necessarily mean the systems are integrated. So, I will say that first, that as the first tier of education, I think childcare should be part of an integrated childcare system where we're recognized and valued as partners in children's learning. So, I think along with that would provide the infrastructure to address some of the governance issues that we have. We have so many parent boards that are struggling that, their responsibilities are beyond their ability. They may have the knowledge, but they don't have the time, or it's just a real problem in terms of governance. So, I think we definitely need a different kind of model. I think we have the political support now. Again, I'm going to refer to our probe research survey that really uncovered public support, parent support, business leader support. That childcare needs to be a priority of a provincial government, and I don't think that's not going to go back in time and can only help in years going forward. So I think we have a real good foundation on which to build. I wish that the workforce could be a priority. I know with more than 16,000 names on our online waiting list, it's spaces that are the priority, and we have to keep reminding government that there's lots of moving parts to building a childcare system. And so when you talk about spaces, you also need to make sure that there's a trained, skilled, experienced, well-compensated workforce, and you need to plan for that at the same time that you're planning for spaces. So, I hope that is in our very near future too. So, and I would like a time where parents can access a childcare space when they need it. On a timely basis, the same way there's a seat in the kindergarten classroom when your child turns 5. If you as a parent choose an early learning and childcare experience, whether you're employed or as a child development approach, I would like for there to be a space, full-time, part-time, extended hour, evening. So we've got a lot of building to do in our system. And I don't think, I start off by saying, okay, 1976, we didn't really have a clue what we needed. We weren't really sure about how to do it, and we certainly didn't know where we were going. But in 2017, I think we've learned a lot, and I think the model is there. The former government left us with the report of the Commission on Early Learning and Childcare that provides a very good roadmap for moving forward. So, we know where we need to go, and we have some support coming from the federal government again. Hopefully we can hang on to the support shown so far from our provincial government, and working together, I think we can continue to take steps forward. I don't think it's going to be fast. I think we move forward slowly, sometimes so slowly you can't even see it. But I think it takes people who have been around for a while to be able to look back and go, it may look like we haven't made any headway, but man, we're light years ahead from where we were.
That's great. Anything else you'd like to add? Anything that we didn't cover? I mean, we could talk for a long time, but any personal highlights or anything personally that you'd really like to have communicated?
I just wanted to acknowledge the Federation, because what I didn't mention in terms of a highlight is back in the days when the Federation was in a better spot and there was project funds available. There were lots of projects that needed steering committees, and I was on several of them. So from recognition to remuneration, our childcare workforce, I think, was the first one, and Partners in Quality, of course. And I remember as being part of those projects, the opportunity to come together and meet people from across the country and hear what's happening in other provinces and listen to other perspectives, and to be talking to each other and learning at the same table, and having the opportunity to meet people that I've sat in rooms with prime ministers and high level policy wonks, and for someone who never intended to be an advocate, was never on my radar. That all that was definitely a highlight. And hearing Sandy this morning just brought some of that back. That some of those tables that we were at, and listening to her, and I had always considered her a mentor, and I remember more than once thinking, man, when I grow up, I'm grown up now, but at that time I was. I would like to be just like her. I would like to have her way with words and know what she knows. And I don't know if that's ever going to happen. Probably not now. It's too late. But
I think it has. But anyway.
yeah. So, it's been a wonderful, wonderful sector to be part of. And, I'm not one bit sorry that as each of these opportunities came my way, that I did jump in, even though sometimes I felt like I was ill-equipped, didn't know what I was doing.
Thank you, Pat. That's been great. Thank you.